All right, hey guys. So I'm still working on figuring out the camera that Mr. Quisenberry gave me. So what I want to do is I'm trying to do it to where I can show you guys like the screen, but since I'm not at the high school, I don't get that option. So try not to make you sick by holding it here. So what I want to do is I want to kind of walk you through it. So we left off with Pearl Harbor, and in 1941 the Japanese bombed Pearl. And so now we're kind of got that little bit of bottom of the page left, which is Singapore, Bataan, those kind of things. So the same day that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they also hit Wake Island, Guam, Singapore, and the Philippines, plus other places. Now the Philippines will hold out for a while and basically fight as much as they can under Douglas MacArthur, who will eventually kind of have to escape and go to Australia. Now, your slideshow you want to start with here is where it says U.S. surrenders to Corregidor, the Philippines, March of 42. So in 1942, after months of fighting, the United States military surrenders in the islands of Corregidor and Bataan. Now, the unfortunate part about this is that the Americans didn't realize at that point that the Japanese believed that if you surrendered, you were a coward. So what ends up happening is what becomes known as the Bataan Death March. Now, when we get back to class, if you have more questions about this, I'll answer them. But it's a really, really brutal kind of a moment in American history. 76,000 prisoners, American and Filipino, are taken. 12,000 of those are Americans. And on this march of 60 miles, they executed guys. These guys were already sick. Most of them had malaria, beriberi, which is a jungle disease. 104, 105 temperature. And what ends up happening is if any of them fell out, any of them passed out, the Japanese just let them die. So it was really, really bad. About 1,100, 1,200 Americans died in the first few days of the march. But the Japanese march them all the way up to a place called Camp O'Donnell, and then eventually to a place called Cabanatuan City. And again, over the next few years, as you kind of look through these Bataan slides, American and British POWs, but under the control of the Japanese, are treated horrifically. Bataan becomes known as the Bataan Death March because so many guys died kind of during that. Now, while we're fighting in Bataan, or at least trying to hold on to it, the Japanese are fighting what's called the China-Burma campaign. Eventually, the Americans will call this the CBI. But in that Burma campaign, basically, they're forced labor to build this Burma road, which in your PowerPoint, if you look at it, you'll see it. Pretty amazing feat of engineering, but it cost the lives of thousands of British and Australian prisoners. The Americans have a group that eventually ends up in 1942 under a guy named Joe Stilwell, fighting in the China-Burma theater, but those guys will be kind of stuck there till 44, 45. So for our story, the next little piece is the first time the Americans actually get a shot at coming back. So what happens is that in 1942, the Americans decide to launch a raid on Tokyo. So the raid is going to be pretty simple. And again, it's called Doolittle's Raid. What you get is a group of B-25 Mitchells, which is the plane that is actually named after the guy who kind of developed the Air Force. In my classroom, I'll show you one later. They take off the USS Hornet in April of 1942, and they bomb Tokyo, Yokohama, and a couple of other places. Now, the bombing doesn't do much damage. And you can kind of click through the slideshow to see pictures of Jimmy Doolittle, pictures of the Raiders, those kind of things. The bombing doesn't do much damage, but what it does is that it literally shakes the foundations of what the Japanese believed. Again, they thought that we could kind of be out of the war for a year and a half, and here it is less than 6 months later, and we're bombing the capital 6 miles from the emperor's home. This freaks them out. This is going to lead them to do some stupid things in the Pacific Theater, at Coral Sea, at Midway, which we'll get to when we're done with the Japanese part. However, for the United States, as soon as we get into the war, it's going to take us a little bit of time. Now, in June of 1941, the Germans, losing my mind, the Germans actually have already invaded Russia. So by December of 41, when the United States is in, Germany's already at war with the Soviet Union, and it has gone really, really well. Understand that when he invades the Soviet Union in what is called Operation Barbarossa, that it has gone really, really, really well for Hitler and for the Nazi army. They have stomped a mud hole in the Russian defenses. They've pushed them out of Poland already. They have pushed them deep into into Soviet territory. They are killing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. They have every possible human advantage. I mean, everything. And Russia's on its heels. A lot of this stuff goes back to the fact that Stalin had killed 8 out of every 10 of his commanding officers. And so that's a problem. And so what you end up seeing happen at this point is that this Operation Barbarossa advances along a large front very quickly, very fast, and the Russians are in retreat. Now, when Stalin hears that they're invaded, it's actually kind of a cool story. When he hears they're invaded, dude goes to his room, stays there for about 3 days, comes out later and says basically any general that's retreated, any soldier that's retreated should be shot. Any general should be not only shot but fired. And again, the Russian army's in a lot of trouble. Hydration. Now, following this, we have a couple of major events. You can kind of go through your slideshow and see some of the mapping activity of how all this goes down. By 1941, the Germans are right outside the city of Moscow, within like 20 miles. They can see the city burning. The people in the city are trying to get out, but Stalin won't let them leave. And basically, the German army is within a matter of days of taking the capital. Well, the citizens of Moscow have banded together. I mean, they're digging tank breaks. They're doing everything they can. There's a place called Vyazma outside of the city that honestly is just a bloodbath between the Germans and the Russians. After a month of fighting, amazingly enough, and again, mother class longer story, but after about a month of fighting in the Battle of Moscow, the Soviet Union is actually able to hold the Germans off. And the way they do it's actually pretty interesting. Germany gets, again, within 20 miles. The city is burning. It looks as if everything's going to fall apart. Stalin actually refuses to leave. What he does, however, is they're able to keep the Germans focused on almost this central battle that's going on right at the city itself. And because they're able to focus them on that central battle, they don't really look at their flanks. That's kind of around the sides of them. And what ends up going on with that is that the Russian army is able to simply bring up and flank and envelop this German army right outside of the city of Vyazma I talked about and push them out. So in 1941, Moscow is saved, and Russia is basically now, they've lost a couple of places. They've lost Leningrad in the north, which is used to be St. Petersburg. It is now under siege. Moscow was basically cut off, and now the focus for the German army turns south in 1942 to a place called Stalingrad. Now, Stalingrad is the bloodiest battle in world history. 2.5 million casualties between the Germans and the Russians. It is a slaughter. In 1942, the Germans invade Stalingrad. And again, if you're following through on your slideshow, you should be able to go through this. And they very quickly take about 80-90% of the city. Problem is, they bomb the crap out of the city. They destroy everything else. What they do is they create a good hiding place for the Russians to kind of fight from. And so instead of fighting a big army, what they're fighting is basically just hello, I am now teaching the lesson. What they're fighting is basically now just kind of a small group of guys who are, okay, the whiskers are in the kitty cat. You're going to have to get out of the way. You're going to teach it now. Don't walk on the clipboard. All right, so they're fighting that's not distracting. They're fighting basically kind of a house-to-house battle. If you'll take a look at the slide that's got the picture of the building, it says it was claimed during the Battle of Stalingrad that more Germans died unsuccessfully to capture this building from 25 Soviet soldiers and 10 civilians than they died in the entire invasion of Paris. Literally, this is kind of the way it worked. We call it the Ratzenkrieg in Stalingrad. Floor to floor, level to level. You take the first floor, and then you move up to the second, and you take that. And by the time you get to the third and you've knocked the Russians out, they've refilled the bottom 3 floors, and you've got to go back down. It becomes a war of attrition, and the Russians are just basically holding on with all they've got. Now, after almost 6 months of fighting, the temperatures were ridiculous. Men are freezing to death. The body count is atrocious. What the Russians are able to do, much like they did in Moscow, was they get the Germans to focus, especially a general by the name of Friedrich von Paulus, will focus on that last 10% of Stalingrad. Well, as he focuses on the last 10% of Stalingrad, they envelop him in this operation. Wait for it. Uranus. Yes, awesome name. So they envelop them in an operation called Uranus, which was really a pain in the butt for the Germans. Anyway, so after a couple of weeks of fighting there, the entire force of Friedrich von Paulus is surrounded. 350,000 Germans are trapped. He calls back to Hitler and says, please let me surrender. Hitler denies him and actually says, I'm promoting you to field marshal. And just a reminder, no field marshal has ever surrendered in German history. And also, like Leonidas at Thermopylae, you'll be remembered. Von Paulus is like, screw you. I got no men. I got no guns. I got nothing. I'm not letting all these guys die. So by the time von Paulus surrenders to the Russian army at Stalingrad, 90,000 is all he's got left. Out of 350,000 men, all he has left is 90,000 guys. So it's a big loss. Now, most of those guys are going to end up being forced to rebuild Stalingrad. They'll all die. I think 5,000 is all that'll ever make it back out of the Stalingrad pocket. So out of 350,000 men in Stalingrad, von Paulus is going to lose 345,000 of those men. But Stalingrad's a turning point. It is that moment in the European theater where Russia is now starting to push out and Hitler's starting to kind of get defeated. Again, there's so much more to this, but doing it this way, I'm just kind of giving you basic nuts and bolts. And again, following along in your notes. Use the textbooks thing I outlined. Use my outline. You should be good. Try to avoid the cat's butt, which is now in your image, brought to you by Operation Uranus for real. The cat's kind of entertained by all this. You've got to get off the table. All right, so back to the story. So after 1942, you should be at a slide right now that shows this here. This is where I want us to be. I don't know if you can see that. That's where I want us to be, where the Germans are just basically being held back by the Nazi army. Sorry, trying to make you guys too sick. Well, that's good. Yeah, this has been brought to you by nausea. Take your nausea medicine. Anyway, so they're holding them back. So the Germans are defeated at Stalingrad, and now it's nothing but retreat. So we slide back down over to our North African campaign. Not sure where this is on your notes. Might have to kind of shuffle through. I got all the notes for everything else, but since I printed these for you, I didn't bring copies of these home. So in my stuff, it goes now from Stalingrad we're to North African campaign. I think this is where we go back to that page that we kind of went to earlier. But in 1942, El Alamein. So you're looking for El Alamein, 1942. This is North Africa. So America's in the war. Russia's trying to kind of hold the line. We're all ready to go fight. So in 1942, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and Bernard Montgomery, the British general, are fighting it out in North Africa. Well, in 1942 November, we launch what is called Operation Supercharger. Now, if you slide through, you'll see El Alamein, the Africa Corps. You'll see a picture of Rommel with his sweet goggles on. So what I want you to understand is that in 1942, we led on Operation Torch in Morocco, Casablanca, Algeria. So we're on the West Coast. The British are here. Rommel's in the middle. Well, together we start closing in. And as we're closing in on Rommel, he takes and runs. Rommel escapes. We are able to push him out of Libya. There's a huge battle, big battle called El Alamein. It's a meat grinder, almost like a World War I type battle between the Deutsche Afrika Corps of Rommel and the Panzer divisions of Rommel against the British army under Bernard Montgomery, which helps that here comes the American army from the West. Now, we're a bad army at this point. It isn't until a guy named George Patton takes ours over a little later in our fight that we get better. But either way, the American and the British armies are able to push them out of El Alamein, and we crush them in the middle. Well, most of the German army escapes through Libya, up through Tunisia, which is modern-day Tunis, across Tunis, over into Sicily. So North Africa is a real big victory moment in the overall scheme of things that's going on for the Americans. Now, again, so the Russians have won at Stalingrad. The British have won in El Alamein. We're coming in from this way. Stalin's begging for a second front. England's holding the line. We're bombing him in the air. We're controlling him in the water. And the reason America's able to do all this, and I'm not sure if I have this in your notes, but I do have it in my PowerPoint if you go through, is the economics. And you should see a bunch of things with the women's stuff, with Rosie the Riveters and all the different women working to kind of get us going. All of these things are what allow us to launch Operation Torch, which should be the slide after the women. Operation Torch is what allows us, under towards Patton's command later to kind of push through. Now, the slide that you see that follows Operation Torch map, the guy sitting in the Jeep, this one right here, this is Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower is given the overall command